Hi, I'm going to present now on the status and conservation of purple martins in Northern California with special reference to the Sacramento population where I've been working for many years. Um, for those who don't know, the Western purple martin is a separate subspecies separated from the Eastern and Southwestern martin. It occupies a range that includes the Rocky Mountains, the Intermountain West, and the Pacific Coast region. There are a number of differences between the Western purple martin and Eastern martin. First, they're genetically distinct as subspecies separated over 200,000 years ago. They are much less abundant. Western purple martins number about 7,000 individuals compared to perhaps as many as 12 million in the East. The plumage of Western martins is lighter in the female and in the subadult male. They are larger by about 3% than the Eastern martins. And importantly, they use different nest sites. Our birds don't use apartment-style nest boxes with few exceptions, but mostly nest in snags or individual boxes. And then finally, they have a separate wintering area, at least apparently from our limited data. Nest sites used by Western martins within their range also varies quite a bit. As you can see, nest boxes predominate in British Columbia and Washington. They're about 50-50 in Oregon, but in California, our birds are mainly still using snags, but a substantial number using these bridges that I'll talk about in some detail. The last population assessment to determine the status was one I conducted in 2009 in Northern California. There we attempted to evaluate abundance trends at the few sites where we had good historical data on numbers, and then at other sites assess occupancy rates, that is, whether sites were still occupied that had been previously occupied. The results of these studies show that among the 4 sites with long-term data, 2 were stable, 1 disappeared entirely, and 1 was in major decline. The occupancy sites, we found that only about 58% of the sites occupied in the 1990s were still occupied in 2009. So a loss of about 3% of colony sites in the state. And based on that, our best available information says that the population in California is still declining. This graph shows you the current breeding distribution of purple martins. This is slightly overstated because of the size of these boxes used in eBird, which is the source of these data. As you can see, the distribution is spotty and localized, except along the north and central coast of California. And the species has been mostly eliminated from its former ranges in the interior portion of the state and in much of Southern California. Since 2009, there are some recent indications of population status, but these are fragmentary and incidental for the most part. Positive signs are that we have a second nest box colony established in Napa. We only have 2 in the state, but several others are starting to show promise. A 2021 resurvey that I did in coastal Mendocino County of bridges in that area showed that all previously occupied sites, those occupied in 2009, continue to be occupied. And in fact, one that had disappeared has become reoccupied. But there are some signs, negative signs, indicators as well. The Lava Beds National Monument population has completely disappeared. This unique population that nested underground in these underground lava tubes is pretty much gone. We also had hoped that all of the fires that we see in forests out in the West would create habitat that martins would occupy, but we found surveys have found that only 3 of 133 burn sites surveyed were occupied by martins. So that's not happening. And then a third negative indicator is the decline of the Sacramento population, which I'll turn to now. I've been working on the ecology and conservation of this bridge nesting population in urban Sacramento for over 30 years now. And I'll give you a brief history of the species in the Central Valley and Sacramento. This picture is from the gold rush. Before that gold rush in 1849, martins presumably nested in snags along the rivers. We don't really have much information. But interestingly, as early as 1876, martins were reported using buildings in Sacramento. For a substantial period thereafter, up until the 1960s, martins occupied these tile roof buildings and other niches in buildings throughout the Central Valley in many of the towns. And the populations were reported to probably be increasing due to the use of buildings in the 1940s. The next phase of martin history starts in the early 1970s when martins fortunately adopted bridges for nesting. They nested up inside these elevated freeways where they entered through these small so-called weep holes underneath. The starling also arrived during this period to California and immediately outcompeted martins from snags and buildings throughout the valley, except in the bridges. So the entire Central Valley population was eliminated, except those few birds nesting in bridges. And this population was doing actually quite well until 2004. It was increasing. However, this is what's happened since 2004. As you can see here, the number of nesting pairs has declined from 173 pairs down to just over 20 this year. The colony sites, number of colony sites has decreased from 12 to 5, and we have an overall 88% decline in the population. Notably, these declines have occurred across all colony sites. They're not focused in any particular area. So why is the population declining? Well, at the most basic level, we can say that a population declines when reproduction or recruitment is lower than mortality. So there's not sufficient reproduction to offset natural mortality. And we developed a population model to relate these various factors with our known populations. And in doing so, we recognize that we know the population size from our censuses, and we had the adult survival rate of this population during its decline from color banding studies that we had conducted. So with this information, we could use the model to calculate the reproductive rate or first-year survival rate that produces the next year's population. We essentially solve the equation. And when you do so, what we saw is over the 2004 to 2009 period, the population dropped by 50%. And during this period, adult survival was slightly low. Reproduction was quite low at 1.64 young per pair, which is half of what is typical. And so this modeling provides strong evidence that low reproduction or recruitment is the cause of the species decline in Sacramento. But why is that happening? And in order to evaluate that, we looked at the extent, how broadly various factors may be operating, and how the magnitude, how severe are the effects. And we identified a number of factors that we determined had low effect. Starling competition really does not occur in the bridges because of the abundance of nest holes that are available. General human disturbance has not been a factor. The birds associate with humans readily. We thought climate change was a good candidate because it would affect all colonies that we've seen decline. But when we looked at the numbers over this period, looked at the temperatures over this period, you can see that at least during the breeding season, the temperatures have not increased that dramatically as opposed to other times of the year. So this could not really be explained as a likely cause. We looked at a number of other factors that are localized in their effects. That is, they occur at one or a few colonies. Vehicle collisions, feral cat predation that we solved at the one site it occurred, kestrel predation we had just at a few sites, and colony disturbance due to construction. So these factors contribute to the decline, but they aren't the primary cause of widespread decline. Another factor that we looked at that had widespread but limited effect was nestling fallout from holes, these vertical holes, and the birds lean over and can fall out. But we have solved that problem in most cases, and it is a relatively limited impact anyway. But we solved it by inserting these nest guards that create a railing to prevent fallout. So finally, we get to the one factor that we feel is likely to have had widespread and a substantial effect, and that is neonicotinoid pesticides. And this operates by reducing insect prey that results in lower survival and especially reproduction. This graph shows you the increase in the use of neonicotinoids since they began being used in the 1990s. And note here that we have a dramatic, rapid increase just during the period when we had the largest decline over 2008 to 2010. And this graph shows you how populations of martins declined while neonicotinoid use was increasing. So from 2003, we had a rapid decline at relatively low pesticide levels, and that as levels have continued to increase, the populations have leveled out, but at a low level. So what's the ultimate fate of the Sacramento population? Well, there are two possibilities. It may just decline until it's extirpated, and looking at various rates of decline over various time periods, we say that loss could occur in 5 to 30 years. But another possibility is that the population will remain at a low level until pesticide impacts decrease. So birds can live on those few areas that are not affected by pesticides. But this can only happen if the land use conflicts that occur in this urban area don't eliminate the birds first. And we have many challenges for colonies in the urban environment as a result of poor planning for transportation, infrastructure, and development projects. So our goal is to maintain the population and protect it from development and construction impacts until the pesticide use can be resolved. And we have done that largely through, I have developed a conservation plan for the city of Sacramento that provides a comprehensive summary of ecology and population status, habitat management needs, land use planning guidelines, and importantly, site-specific information on each colony. Where do they nest? Where do they get nesting material? Where do they perch? How do they access the site? And monitoring protocols. And this guide has been put into use to improve the protection during construction projects. This book is available if you're interested. So what are the future for Sacramento colonies? Well, the population is reduced, but the decline is slowing. The presumed cause is insecticide effects, but new threats are constantly emerging, sometimes unexpected ones, like fires caused by homeless people who live under some of these sites. We've tried all the conservation measures that we can think of: nest boxes, habitat protection, developing and erecting perch sites, providing nesting material, and we still have not been successful. So extirpation could occur within the next 10 to 30 years, or they may hang on in their current or somewhat more reduced small numbers. We need to continue to monitor and protect the habitat in land use projects, and most importantly, we need a broad campaign to address the effects of insecticides on the species. So with that, I thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions from you at this point.
Fascinating long-term study of it's just a really uniquely nesting purple martin colony there in California. My own question before we get too deep here: how open has the Sacramento, officials, have they been to your, conservation plans?
Recently, you're hearing me okay, Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah, recently, we finally got their attention, and, preparing this book, which basically said, here it all is. You have to follow this. You have no excuses, is the thing that finally has gotten their attention. But it's been very difficult, working in an urban environment. Naturally, planners just think, well, there's nothing of any biological value here. Even biologists, consultants forget to even check to see whether martins are in these areas when they're doing environmental documents. So we have been constantly playing catch up, trying to inform people, often at the last minute when it's inconvenient and disruptive. Wait a minute, you've got a big problem here. So I think we're finally getting the attention of Caltrans, the state transportation agency, and had really good cooperation on a very big project affecting 2 of the 5 remaining colonies. So we're making a little progress.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I know that this has been a long, practically lifelong passion here to monitor these birds and to kind of protect them. So I'm so glad to hear that it's beginning to be, received well. Couple of questions here out of chat. Gene asks, are neonics not used in the eastern U.S.? Are they noting decline with pesticide use there too?
Well, that's not something I study in terms of the effects, but I can tell you the maps. There's a recent map that I think Cornell lab put out showing distribution of insecticide use, of neonics, and the biggest concentrations are the Central Valley of California, and I think the Upper Ohio Basin area. And so I'm guessing that some of the declines that you folks talk about are similarly related to depauperate insect food supplies there.
Yeah, it almost certainly is a factor in the East as well. It's very hard to create that one-to-one connection between the two things, but the correlation and the known effects of those systemic pesticides on just insect populations as a whole, you can't argue with the fact that that's got to be affecting purple martins.
It's very challenging because nobody collected information on insect abundance in the past. So you have very little. I found one study that we could look at to see whether there had been changes, and it showed dramatic changes. But that's a key lack that we can't fix at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, you needed to have these studies, long-term studies in place before these insecticides became in use, so you can show that there are fewer insects now, and it's extremely rare that something that long-term has been going on.
Just one other thing, yeah. Quickly, Joe, that the reference in the Purple Haze movie about windshields and how often do you have to clean bugs off your windshield. Everyone I talk to who's lived in California for a long time says that same thing. We had to wash our windshields twice a week. Now we never really do.
Oh yeah, yeah. You at least when you got gas, usually you had to make a couple extra stops, in between gas tanks, right? Yeah. And now it's been years since I've had to actually scrub my windshield. So Maria in chat says, do you collect data on return rate to the Sacramento colonies? Any idea if the birds are returning to them year after year?
Well, our banding study lasted about 5 years during this period of about 2003 to 2009. And, it's a lot of work. And we were able to document that rapid decline. And yes, we do have return rates, which are the so-called survival rates that we use, because the birds are so easy to see with bands on. You can just visually verify that what birds you have and which ones didn't arrive. And the return rates are slightly lower than the averages from other studies, but not that noticeable, which leads me to believe that the problems, originally we thought, the problems must be those people in Latin America using pesticides or something, and that's not consistent with what the data show, that the return rates are pretty good. It's what's happening here that is affecting the populations.
So much interest here. I can highly recommend Dan's book. I see somebody was asking for the address, but then that was answered farther down in chat. Last question here then from Jason. Do you think neonics are reducing food availability or leading to direct toxicological effects on martins? What do you think?
I think it's probably the former, that is just a lack of insects. Presumably a lot of the neonics that are the insects that receive neonic doses just die and they're not available. But I'm interested in studies to see whether sublethal effects of pesticides are present in insects that the birds are producing. Certainly there are effects on seed-eating birds where they eat seeds treated with neonics that are shown to cause effects on migration, orientation. So it could be a direct effect, but I think most likely that all these neonics are just running off into our aquatic habitats because they're water soluble, and they're just suppressing the populations of dragonflies strongly. Just anecdotally, I see that. I don't have swarms of dragonflies like I had at the beginning of my study, and that's what the birds were bringing in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, I wish we could stick with the questions. If you don't mind hanging out in chat and answering those, and thank you so much for sharing, the results of this and really important research that you're doing with those Sacramento martins.
Thanks so much, Joe. It's good to be with the tribe. I'm pretty lonely out here.
Yeah, you are on an island, my man. All right,
care.
thanks.
Sure.